The air inside the Costello estate in the hills of Sicily didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and the suffocating weight of 300 years of violent tradition. Lorenzo Costello stood at the head of the mahogany banquet table, his tailored suit as sharp as the obsidian rings on his fingers, but his eyes, usually like flint, were clouded with a desperate, suppressed rage. Today was the vowing. The day his only son, Luca Vallone, was supposed to stand before the gathered kapos and swear his first oath of silence and loyalty to the family. But there was a different kind of silence in the room. A silence that was a curse. Luca, 10 years old and porcelain pale, stood on a small velvet stool so he could look the grizzled men in the eye. He looked like a prince, but to the men gathered there, men who valued strength above all else, he looked like a liability. Lorenzo's hand rested on Luca's shoulder, his grip tightening just enough to be felt, a silent plea for a miracle. "Speak, Luca," Lorenzo whispered, his voice a low, vibrating growl that barely masked the tremor of a father's breaking heart. "Just the first word. Honor. Honor. Say it for the family. Say it for me." The room held its breath. The kapos leaned in, their faces etched with scars and skepticism. Luca opened his mouth. His small chest heaved. His throat worked, the muscles corded with a frantic effort that turned his face a deep, painful crimson. But nothing came out. Not a word. Not a grunt. Not even a breath of sound. The silence stretched, becoming a physical entity, a wall of shame that threatened to topple the Costello dynasty. Lorenzo felt the eyes of his underlings shifting. He saw the subtle nods, the predatory glints in the eyes of men who smelled blood in the water. A boss with a mute heir was a boss with a fractured future. In the world of the Italian underworld, a man's word was his bond, and a boy with no words was a boy with no power. "Enough," Lorenzo barked, the word cutting through the tension like a gunshot. He didn't look at his son. He couldn't. The shame was a hot coal in his stomach. "The boy is tired. The ceremony is concluded. We drink to the future regardless." The party moved to the terrace, the forced laughter and clinking of crystal failing to mask the rot of disappointment. Lorenzo walked to the edge of the stone balcony, looking out over the iron gates of his fortress. He was the most powerful man in the region, a man who could order a death with a flick of his wrist, yet he was powerless against the silence of his own flesh and blood. Every doctor, every specialist, every miracle worker from Milan to New York had been paid millions only to say the same thing. There is no physical cause. The boy simply cannot. That was when Lorenzo saw him. Down by the perimeter fence, past the guards with their submachine guns, a small figure was huddled against the rain. A homeless boy no older than Luca, wearing rags that were more holes than fabric. He was barefoot on the sharp gravel, his hair a matted nest of dark curls. Most of the guards would have beaten him away, but there was something about the way the boy stood, perfectly still, his eyes fixed not on the mansion, but directly on the window where Luca sat alone in his room. Lorenzo felt a strange, primal jolt of electricity. "Who is that?" he demanded of his chief of security. "Just a stray Don Lorenzo. We'll clear him out." "No," Lorenzo said, his voice cracking with an instinct he didn't understand. "Bring him to me." Minutes later, the homeless boy was dragged into the opulent study. He smelled of rain and wood smoke. He stood before Lorenzo, not with the trembling fear of a beggar, but with the terrifying calm of a prophet. His name, he claimed, was Enzo Mancini. "You have a son who lives in a cage of shadows," Enzo said, his voice raspy but clear, lacking any of the deference usually shown to a man of Lorenzo's stature. Lorenzo lunged forward, grabbing Enzo by the collar of his tattered shirt. "You dare speak of my son? You are a ghost from the gutter. What could you possibly know of my blood?" "I know that your blood is screaming, Lorenzo Costello," Enzo whispered, his eyes locking onto Lorenzo's with an intensity that made the Mafia boss recoil. "He isn't dumb. He is holding back a secret that would burn this house to the ground. He isn't broken. He is protecting you." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "He is a child. He knows nothing of my business." "He knows what he saw in the cellar when he was 4, Enzo replied. The color drained from Lorenzo's face. The cellar. The night of the red moon. A night Lorenzo had spent 10 years trying to erase from history. A night that was supposed to have no witnesses. "Take me to him," Enzo commanded. "I will make him speak." But remember, Don Lorenzo. Once a silence is broken, it can never be mended. Are you prepared for the truth to have a voice? Driven by a cocktail of desperation and a creeping, icy dread, Lorenzo led the homeless boy up the grand staircase to Luca's room. Luca was sitting by the window, tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass. When he saw Enzo, something happened that Lorenzo had never seen in 10 years. Luca's eyes didn't just widen, they ignited. A look of recognition, of pure, unadulterated terror and relief, flooded his face. Enzo walked toward the heir of the Castello Empire. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a smile. He leaned in and whispered a single short sentence into Luca's ear, a sentence so quiet Lorenzo couldn't catch a single syllable. For a heartbeat the world stopped. Then Luca Vallone, the boy who had never made a sound, let out a gasp that sounded like a drowning man reaching the surface. His lips trembled. His vocal cords, dormant for a decade, vibrated with a raw, agonizing power. "Father," Luca sobbed. The word hit Lorenzo like a physical blow. He fell to his knees, clutching his son, tears streaming down his rugged, scarred face. It was a miracle. It was the impossible. His son had spoken. But as Lorenzo looked up at the homeless boy, Enzo wasn't smiling. He was staring at the portrait of Lorenzo's father on the wall with a look of cold, calculating vengeance. "The debt is acknowledged," Enzo said softly. "Now the payment begins." Lorenzo's heart hammered against his ribs. What had the boy said? And how did a child from the streets know a secret that was supposed to be buried under 6 feet of concrete and a decade of lies? The morning following the miracle did not bring the peace Lorenzo Castello had envisioned for a decade. Instead, it brought a heavy, shimmering tension that draped over the Castello villa like a funeral shroud. The sun rose over the Tyrrhenian Sea, casting long, golden fingers across the marble floors, but the light felt intrusive, exposing the cracks in a foundation Lorenzo had spent his life trying to make impenetrable. Lorenzo sat in the breakfast room, a space of glass and white stone that overlooked the lemon groves. He wasn't eating. His coffee had gone cold, a dark oily film forming on the surface. His eyes were fixed on the doorway, waiting for the sound of footsteps, the sound of a voice. To the world, Lorenzo was a monolith. He was the man who had consolidated the fractured families of Palermo through a series of purges that were spoken of only in terrified whispers. His deepest desire wasn't money or territory. He had enough of both to bury his enemies. His desire was immortality. Not for himself but for the Castello name. He saw himself as a builder, a man who had taken a gutter-born legacy and turned it into an empire. But a legacy required a vessel, and for 10 years that vessel had been a cracked jar, unable to hold the weight of the words that defined their world. "He's still sleeping," a soft, melodic voice broke his trance. Lorenzo turned. Standing in the doorway was Sofia Moretti. Sofia was his late wife's younger sister, a woman whose grace was a sharp contrast to the jagged edges of the men who inhabited the villa. She had been the surrogate mother to Luca since Isabella's death during childbirth, a tragedy that Lorenzo secretly blamed on the boy, adding a layer of subconscious resentment to his disappointment over Luca's silence. "Did he say anything else?" Lorenzo asked, his voice cracking. "After I left the room last night? Did he speak to you, Sofia?" Sofia walked to the table, her silk robe trailing behind her. She sat down, her expression a mix of awe and profound concern. "Not a word, Lorenzo. But his eyes, they're different. The fog is gone. It's as if he's finally come back from a very long distance. But he's terrified. He keeps looking at the door as if he's waiting for someone to come in and take the voice back." "The boy," Lorenzo said, his jaw tightening. "The beggar. Where is he?" "In the guest quarters under guard as you ordered," Sofia replied, her eyes narrowing. "Lorenzo, who is he? How did a child from the streets of the Capo district know about the cellar? You told me no one was there that night. You told me the business was finished before the boy was even born." Lorenzo stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair screeching against the marble. "The business is finished. What happened in the cellar was a necessity of war. It was the price of this house, the price of the air you breathe." But internally Lorenzo was reeling. His deepest fear wasn't the rival families or a police raid. It was the realization that the past was not a ghost, but a living, breathing entity. He remembered the cellar, the damp, iron-scented darkness beneath the old winery. He remembered the man who had begged for mercy, a man who had once been his closest friend, and the choice Lorenzo had made to ensure his own rise to power. He had thought he was alone. He had thought his 4-year-old son was safely tucked away in the nursery upstairs. He left Sofia and marched toward the guest wing. He needed to understand the leverage this homeless boy held. Enzo Mancini was sitting on the edge of a bed that cost more than a street child could earn in 3 lifetimes. He hadn't touched the feast the servants had brought him. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, watching the door. When Lorenzo entered, Enzo didn't flinch. "You have a name that doesn't belong to a beggar," Lorenzo said, looming over the boy. "Mancini. That's a name from the north. From the old Steele families. Names are just sounds we make to pretend we own things," Enzo said, his voice possessing a rhythmic, haunting quality. "I am the son of a man who trusted a wolf. I am the shadow of a debt that was never paid. What did you say to my son?" Lorenzo growled, reaching out to grab the boy's arm, but stopping short when he saw the look in Enzo's eyes. It wasn't hatred, it was a profound, weary pity. "I told him that the man in the cellar forgave him," Enzo whispered. "I told him that the blood on the floor wasn't his to wash away." Lorenzo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Luca had seen it. The night Lorenzo had eliminated his predecessor to take the mantle of Dawn, a night of betrayal that had cemented his power, his young son had been watching from the shadows of the staircase. The trauma hadn't just shocked Luca into silence. It had made the boy believe that if he spoke, the same violence would erupt from his own throat. "You were there," Lorenzo breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "You're his son. The man from the cellar. You're Vittorio's boy. My father died so you could wear that ring," Enzo said, pointing to the obsidian signet on Lorenzo's hand. "And your son died inside that night because he saw the monster his father became. I didn't come here for your money, Lorenzo. I came because the silence was killing us both. 2 sons broken by one man's greed." The emotional stakes shifted instantly. Lorenzo wasn't just a father protecting a son. He was a perpetrator facing his victim's child. He looked at Enzo and saw the reflection of his own sins. Enzo wasn't just a mysterious savior. He was the living consequence of the Red Moon massacre. At that moment, the door to the room creaked open. Luca stood there, his small frame silhouetted by the hallway light. He looked from his father, the man he feared, to Enzo, the boy who had given him the keys to his own throat. Luca took a hesitant step forward. His voice was small, fragile like thin glass. "Father." Lorenzo turned, his heart leaping. "Yes, Luca? I'm here." "Did you?" Luca swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears. "Did you hurt the man because of me? Because I was weak?" The question was a dagger. Luca had spent 6 years believing that his father's violence was a reaction to his own perceived failures, or perhaps a warning of what happened to those who spoke out. The secret in the cellar wasn't just a crime, it was a wall of guilt that had kept a child prisoner in his own mind. Lorenzo realized then that his son's disability was actually a profound moral protest. Luca's silence was the only way he knew how to remain innocent in a house built on blood. "No, Luca," Lorenzo said, his voice thick with a genuine, agonizing regret he hadn't felt in decades. "I hurt him because I was weak. Not you." Sofia appeared behind Luca, placing her hands on his shoulders. She looked at Lorenzo with a new kind of horror, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The blood debt wasn't just a metaphor. It was the foundation of their lives. But the moment of connection was shattered by the sound of heavy tires screaming on the gravel outside. Lorenzo's radio crackled to life. "Don Lorenzo. We have a breach at the north gate. It's the Gallus family. They've heard the rumors of the boy speaking. They're calling it a sign of weakness, a distraction." The Galli family. Lorenzo's rivals had been waiting for a moment of internal chaos. The miracle hadn't just brought Luca's voice back. It had signaled to the underworld that Lorenzo Costello was vulnerable, distracted by a street urchin and a long-buried ghost. "Get them to the safe room." Lorenzo barked at Sofia, his boss persona snapping back into place, though it felt more like a mask than ever before. He looked at Enzo. The homeless boy stood up, his gaze never wavering. "You think you can protect him with walls and guns, Lorenzo? You can't fight a curse with bullets. This is only the beginning of the reckoning." Lorenzo grabbed his pistol from his waistband, the cold steel familiar and yet suddenly heavy. He had spent 10 years wishing for his son to speak, and now that he had, the first words out of the boy's mouth had dismantled Lorenzo's entire reality. How much do you love this story so far? If you're feeling the tension between Lorenzo's past and Luca's future, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the shocking revelation in the next act. Lorenzo looked at his son, then at the son of the man he had murdered. The connection between the two boys was an invisible tether, a bond forged in a cellar years ago. He realized that to save Luca he might have to lose everything he had killed to gain. The transition from the miracle of Luca's voice to the mayhem of war happened in the span of a single heartbeat. A deafening roar shattered the morning, a rocket-propelled grenade slamming into the reinforced stone pillars of the villa's north gate. The shockwave rippled through the house, shattering the stained glass windows of the grand foyer into a million crystalline daggers. Lorenzo Costello didn't hesitate. He tackled Luca to the marble floor, shielding the boy's small body with his own as dust and debris rained down upon them. "Sofia, get to the sublevel. Now!" Lorenzo roared over the secondary explosions. He looked at Enzo, the homeless boy who remained standing amidst the chaos, his expression eerily vacant, as if the destruction around him was merely a predictable weather pattern. Move or die. But before they could retreat, the heavy oak doors of the study were kicked open. Through the swirling plaster dust emerged a woman who looked entirely out of place in a war zone. She wore a sharp charcoal gray coat and carried a medical trauma kit, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This was Clara Ripley, a world-renowned pediatric neurologist who had been summoned weeks ago by Sofia in a last-ditch effort to help Luca. She had arrived at the gates exactly as the Galli family launched their assault. "Don Lorenzo?" she gasped, her eyes darting from the blood on Lorenzo's forehead to the terrified child beneath him. "I'm Dr. Ripley. Your security. They were overrun. I barely made it through the perimeter." Lorenzo didn't have time for introductions. He grabbed Clara by the arm, dragging her behind a heavy mahogany desk just as a spray of submachine gun fire chewed through the wood above their heads. "You're a doctor? Then keep my son's heart beating. If he stops breathing, you don't leave this house alive." The threat was primal, a reflex of a man who only knew how to communicate through power. But Clara didn't flinch. She crawled toward Luca, her hands steady despite the thunder of gunfire. "I'm not here for your threats, Costello. I'm here for the boy." As she reached for Luca, her hand brushed Lorenzo's. For a fleeting second, amidst the smoke and the screams of dying men outside, their eyes locked. Lorenzo saw a defiance in her that he hadn't seen in years, a lack of fear that was both infuriating and strangely grounding. In the underworld, women were either protected assets or collateral damage, but Clara stood like a lighthouse in a storm of lead. "Luca," Clara whispered, her voice a calm anchor. "Look at me. Breathe with me." Luca, however, wasn't looking at the doctor. He was looking past her at the balcony. The sliding glass doors shattered inward. A man stepped through the shards, flanked by 3 soldiers in tactical gear. It was Arthur Sloane, the lead enforcer for the Galli family. He was a man of cold, surgical violence, his face bisected by a scar that gave him a permanent, ghastly grin. "Lorenzo," Sloane said, his voice smooth and devoid of the heat of battle. "The word is out. The silent prince has spoken. My employer finds that inconvenient. A mute heir is a tragedy. A speaking heir is a witness." Lorenzo stood up, stepping out from behind the desk. He held his beretta with a practiced, lethal stillness. "He's a child, Arthur. He knows nothing." "He knows what you did to Vittorio Mancini," Sloane countered, his eyes flickering to Enzo, who was still standing by the window. "And it seems he isn't the only Mancini in the room. You kept a viper in your nest, Lorenzo. Did you really think you could kill a king and not expect his line to come for the crown?" The revelation hit Lorenzo like a second explosion. He looked at Enzo. The boy wasn't a mysterious savior who had wandered to the gates by chance. He had been a beacon. "You led them here," Lorenzo hissed at Enzo. "The silence. You didn't break it to save him. You broke it to draw me out." Enzo finally looked at Lorenzo, a single tear carving a path through the grime on his cheek. "I broke it so the truth could be heard before the house fell. My father died in the dark. Your son will live in the light, even if that light is a fire." Suddenly the miracle felt like a death sentence. The Galli family wasn't just here for territory. They were here to cauterize the Costello bloodline before Luca could ever testify to the crimes that had built the empire. Kill the men, Sloane commanded his soldiers, gesturing toward Lorenzo and Enzo. Take the boy and the woman. The Gallis want to hear exactly what the little prince has to say before we cut his tongue out for good. Lorenzo's world narrowed to a single desperate point. He had a split second to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could dive for the hidden panic button behind the desk, which would seal the room and likely trap them all inside a tomb of stone while the Galli forces burned the villa down. Or he could trust the woman he just met and the boy who had betrayed him. Clara, take Luca through the servants' passage. Lorenzo shouted, opening fire on Sloane's men. Go. Don't look back. What about you? Clara cried, clutching Luca to her chest. I'm the debt. Lorenzo roared, the recoil of his weapon jarring his arm. I'm the one who has to pay. As Clara and Luca vanished into the shadowed hallway, followed closely by a silent Enzo, Lorenzo felt a strange, terrifying sense of liberation. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for the family. He was fighting for his son. But as he ducked behind a marble statue of his own grandfather, Sloane's laughter echoed through the room. You think they're safe, Lorenzo? Look at the cameras. Look at who's leading the Galli convoy. Lorenzo glanced at the bank of security monitors on the wall, many of them flickering with static. On the one clear screen he saw the lead black SUV. Stepping out of the vehicle was a woman he recognized instantly. Isabella's sister, the woman he thought was his greatest ally. Sophia. The betrayal was a jagged blade in his gut. Sophia wasn't hiding in the safe room. She was the one who had opened the north gate. She was the one who had coordinated with the Galli family. She wants the empire, Lorenzo, Sloane taunted, advancing slowly. And she knows that as long as Luca is alive and speaking, he's the only thing standing in her way. She didn't want a mute nephew. She wanted a dead one. Lorenzo's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. He had sent his son directly into the arms of the woman who wanted him gone. He had trusted the only family he had left, and in doing so he had signed Luca's death warrant. The miracle had been a trap. The homeless boy was a catalyst. And now, the very voice Lorenzo had prayed for was the reason his son was being hunted. Can Lorenzo reach Luca before Sophia completes her betrayal? And what is the true connection between Clara Ripley and the Mancini past? This story is just getting started and the twists are going to get even more intense. If you're hooked, please drop a Team Luca in the comments and subscribe to see how this blood debt is settled. Lorenzo charged toward Sloane, not with the calculated precision of a Don, but with the raw, unbridled fury of a father who realized he had been played from the very beginning. The villa was burning, the dynasty was crumbling, and the only thing that mattered was a 10-year-old boy who had finally found his voice, only to realize the world wanted him silent forever. The screams of the dying villa were a discordant symphony of cracking timber, shattering glass, and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. Lorenzo Costello moved through the smoke like a predator in a burning forest. He didn't just walk. He flowed, his body operating on decades of muscle memory while his mind was a jagged landscape of fury and betrayal. He had just watched Sophia, the woman who had held Luca when he cried, the woman who had shared his dinner table for years, step out of an enemy vehicle. The sting of it was worse than the bullet that had grazed his shoulder. In the grand foyer, Arthur Sloane's men were closing in. Lorenzo knew the layout of the estate better than his own heartbeat. He ducked behind a velvet curtain, the heavy fabric damp with the spray from the triggered sprinkler system, and waited. As a Galli soldier rounded the corner, Lorenzo didn't use his gun. He used a shard of a broken vase, a jagged piece of Ming Dynasty porcelain. The movement was swift, silent, and final. He didn't feel like a Don anymore. He felt like a father whose nest had been set ablaze. He had to get to the servants' passage. He had to find Luca. Meanwhile, deep beneath the villa, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and centuries of secrets. The servants' passage was a narrow, winding artery of unvarnished stone that led to the old winery. Clara Ripley held Luca's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Behind them, Enzo Mancini walked with a rhythmic, haunting silence, his eyes fixed on the back of Luca's head. Almost there, Luca. Just stay with me, Clara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a woman of science, a woman who dealt in synapses and brain scans, not firefights and ancient blood feuds. Yet as she looked at the trembling boy beside her, a fierce, protective instinct flared up hotter than the fires above. "The doctor is afraid," Enzo said suddenly, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "But fear is a good teacher. It keeps the heart sharp." Clara stopped, turning to look at the homeless boy. "Who are you, Enzo? Really? You're not just some child from the streets. You talk like a man who has lived 1,000 years, and you knew things about this family that even the Costellos didn't realize were known." Enzo leaned against the cold stone wall, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I am the memory that Lorenzo tried to bury. My father, Vittorio, wasn't just Lorenzo's predecessor. He was his brother in everything but blood. They built this empire together, one brick of bone at a time. But my father wanted to go legitimate. He wanted a world where his son didn't have to hide. Lorenzo wanted the crown. So he took it." Luca let out a small, jagged breath. "I saw the red moon," he whispered. It was only the second time he had spoken in 10 years, and the sound of his voice sent a shiver down Clara's spine. It was a beautiful, broken sound. "I saw the silver knife. My father. He didn't look like my father. He looked like a wolf." Clara knelt in front of him, ignoring the grit of the floor on her expensive trousers. She took his face in her hands. "Luca, look at me. Your father is a complicated man, but he loves you. He chose you over his own safety today. Do you understand that?" "He chose the silence," Enzo interjected coldly. He liked that Luca couldn't speak, because as long as the boy was mute, the secret was safe. Lorenzo didn't want a miracle doctor. He wanted a vault. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Clara looked at Luca and saw not just a patient, but a victim of a silence imposed by a father's guilt. She felt a surge of empathy for the boy, but also a strange, confusing pull toward Lorenzo. She had seen the look in his eyes when he stood before the gunman. The look of a man who realized his entire life was a lie and was willing to burn it all down to save one piece of truth. Suddenly, the heavy iron door at the end of the passage groaned. Clara pushed Luca behind her, grabbing a heavy iron candle holder from a wall niche. The door swung open and a figure stumbled in, covered in soot and blood. "Lorenzo." His eyes immediately found Luca. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Luca didn't run to him. He stayed behind Clara. The distance between father and son felt like an ocean. "He's physically fine," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "But he knows Lorenzo. He told me what he saw. He told me about the red moon." Lorenzo's shoulders slumped. The fearsome Don Costello looked for a moment like a broken old man. He looked at Clara, and for the first time he didn't see a doctor he could intimidate. He saw a woman who knew the worst parts of him and hadn't turned away yet. "I did what I had to do to survive," Lorenzo said, his gaze shifting to Enzo. "And you're Vittorio's boy. I should have killed you that night too. It would have been more merciful than letting you rot in the streets. Mercy is for the weak, isn't that what you taught the capos, Lorenzo?" Enzo replied, his voice devoid of heat. "But I didn't come for revenge. I came for the debt. My father's blood bought this villa. Now the Galli family is here to take back what they believe is theirs. Sofia has promised them the Costello ports in exchange for Luca's head." "Sofia." Lorenzo spat the name like venom. "She was my wife's sister. I trusted her with my son's life." "She was never your ally, Lorenzo," Enzo said. "She was Vittorio's lover. She's been waiting 10 years to finish what you started." Another explosion rocked the tunnels, dust raining down from the ceiling. The Galli forces were in the winery. They were minutes away. "We have to move," Lorenzo said, grabbing Clara's hand. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. A moment of shared vulnerability in the dark. "There's an old escape tunnel under the fermentation vats. It leads to the cliffs. I have a boat waiting in the cove." "And then what?" Clara asked, her eyes searching his. "Where do we go? You can't outrun the Mafia forever." "I don't need to outrun them," Lorenzo said, his flinty eyes returning to their former hardness. "I just need to keep Luca alive long enough to reach the archives in Rome. There's a ledger there. Something Vittorio kept. It's the only thing that can stop the Galli family and Sofia. It's the map of the shadows." As they hurried through the darkness, the relationship between Lorenzo and Clara began to shift. It wasn't just a protector and a witness anymore. Clara found herself watching the way Lorenzo moved, the way he constantly checked on Luca, the way his hand lingered near hers as they navigated the treacherous, uneven floor. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster trying to be a man for the sake of his son. They reached the fermentation room, the air thick with the smell of sour grapes and old wood. But they weren't alone. Standing by the exit was Sophia. She wasn't wearing her silk robes anymore. She was in black tactical gear, a sleek submachine gun held effortlessly in her hands. Beside her stood two Galli enforcers, their faces masked. "Lorenzo," Sophia said, her voice echoing with a chilling sweetness. "You always were a creature of habit. I knew you'd head for the vats." "Sophia, why?" Lorenzo asked, stepping in front of Claire and the boys. "I gave you everything. You were family." "Family." Sophia laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You murdered the only man I ever loved in that cellar. You left his son to starve while you raised yours in a palace. You think Isabella died of natural causes? She died of a broken heart because she knew what kind of devil she had married." Lorenzo winced as if struck. The layers of lies were peeling back, revealing a core of pure rot. "The boy has to die, Lorenzo," Sophia continued, her eyes fixing on Luca. "He's the only one who can claim the Mancini inheritance. With him gone and you dead, the Costello and Mancini lines are extinct. The Galli family takes the ports and I take the throne. You'll have to go through me." Clara stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. "I am a witness to this. I am a doctor. I will not let you touch this child." Sophia sneered. "A doctor? How quaint. Kill the woman first. Then the Don. I'll handle the boys myself." The enforcers raised their weapons. Lorenzo braced himself, his hand reaching for his empty holster. He had dropped his gun in the struggle with Sloane. But then the unexpected happened. The night of the red moon. "I didn't kill Vittorio to take his throne," Lorenzo revealed, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "I killed him because he begged me to. He knew the Gallis were coming for Enzo. He told me to kill him, make it look like a betrayal and hide the boy so the Gallis would think the line was ended. He sacrificed his life and his reputation so his son could be free." A heavy silence followed. The monster Lorenzo Costello had been living as for 10 years. The traitor who murdered his best friend was a lie. He had spent a decade playing the villain to protect a secret that kept a child safe. But then Enzo stood up. He walked toward the table, his footsteps silent. "You did a brave thing, Lorenzo," Enzo said, his voice sounding far too old for his body. "But you were a fool. You thought you were protecting one boy. But you forgot the other." "What are you talking about?" Lorenzo asked. Enzo pointed a thin finger at the sealed envelope. "Open it. Read the birth records of the San Giovanni Hospital. October 12th. Lorenzo's brow furrowed. "That's Luca's birthday." He tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the document, and the color drained from his face so quickly Clara thought he might faint. He clutched the paper, his knuckles turning blue. This is impossible," Lorenzo breathed. "What is it?" Clara asked, leaning over. The document wasn't a birth certificate. It was a swap record. "Luca isn't my son," Lorenzo whispered, the words sounding like they were being ripped from his throat. He's the Galli heir. Sophia, she swapped the infants. My biological son died in the nursery that night. Sophia took the Galli child, the baby they were going to use to control the Costello line, and put him in my wife's arms. She wanted to ensure that the man who killed her lover, Vittorio, would spend his life raising his enemy's blood. The twist was a psychological sledgehammer. Luca, the boy Lorenzo had sacrificed his soul to protect, was the direct descendant of the family currently burning down his villa. And Enzo, the homeless boy who had been living in the gutters. "And I," Enzo said, his voice cold as ice, "am the boy you were supposed to save. I am the true Costello heir. Your blood, Lorenzo. Not his." The room seemed to tilt. Lorenzo looked at Luca, then at Enzo. The boy he had loved was his enemy's blood. The boy he had ignored was his own. The miracle of Luca speaking wasn't just a physical breakthrough. It was the universe demanding that the truth be heard. "Is that why you were silent, Luca?" Clara asked, turning to the boy. "Did you know?" Luca looked up, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. "I saw the man in the cellar. But I also saw the woman in the nursery. And Sophia. She whispered to me every night. She told me I didn't belong. She told me if I spoke, the real father would come and take me away to the dark place. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Sofia hadn't just betrayed Lorenzo, she had psychologically tortured a child for a decade, using his own identity as a cage. The debt isn't just money, Lorenzo, Enzo said, stepping closer to his biological father. The Gallis are coming because they know the truth now. They want their heir back and they want the Costello blood. Meet it. We are the living evidence of a swap that failed. Suddenly, the door to the apartment was kicked off its hinges. Down! Lorenzo roared, throwing himself over Clara. A flashbang grenade detonated, filling the room with blinding white light and a high-pitched scream of sound. Through the haze, men in black tactical gear swarmed in. These weren't Galli soldiers. These were elite mercenaries. In the chaos, Lorenzo felt a hand grab his collar. It was Sofia. She had followed them to Rome. The truth is out, Lorenzo, she screamed over the noise. Give me the Galli boy. Give me Luca and I might let the beggar live. Never. Lorenzo fought back, but a rifle butt to the temple sent him spiraling into darkness. As his vision faded, he saw Clara being dragged toward the back exit and Luca, his son in every way that mattered, screaming his name. Father. Father, help us. The voice Lorenzo had waited 10 years to hear was now the sound of his world ending. The world didn't return in colors. It returned in textures of pain. The first thing Lorenzo Costello felt was the biting chill of rusted iron against his wrists. Then came the rhythmic metallic drip 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 of water echoing in a space that felt cavernous and hollow. He tried to move but his shoulders screamed in protest. He was hoisted, arms chained above his head, in what looked like the belly of an abandoned foundry on the outskirts of the Tiber. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and industrial decay. His head throbbed with rhythmic violence, a reminder of the rifle butt that had sent him into the void. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, shearing ache in his chest. He was alone. Luca. He croaked, his voice barely a sandpaper rasp. Clara. They can't hear you, Lorenzo. No one can. The voice came from the shadows, accompanied by the clicking of high heels on the damp concrete. Sofia Moretti stepped into the sickly yellow glow of a single overhead bulb. She looked immaculate, a sharp contrast to the grime of the foundry, her eyes reflecting a cold, predatory triumph. You look small like this, she mused, circling him like a shark. The great Don Lorenzo Costello, reduced to a piece of meat hanging in a cellar. It's poetic, don't you think? It's exactly how Vittorio felt before you ended him. Where are they? Lorenzo spat, a mixture of blood and saliva landing near her feet. If you touch them, Sofia, I will spend eternity finding ways to make you suffer. Sofia laughed, a sound that held no joy, only the brittle edges of madness. You're in no position to bargain. But since you're so curious, Clara Ripley is currently being processed by the Galli enforcers. They find her medical knowledge inconvenient. And the boys? Well, that's where it gets interesting. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. The Galli family is overjoyed to have their lost prince back. They've already taken Luca. They don't care that he was born into your house. They only care about the blood in his veins. But they have a problem, Lorenzo. A prince who has spent 10 years being raised by a Costello is a tainted prince. They're going to re-educate him. And by that I mean they're going to break him until he forgets you ever existed. Lorenzo's heart felt like it was being crushed by a giant's hand. He saw Luca's face, the way the boy had finally looked at him with trust in that Rome apartment. To have that soul crushed and molded by the Galli family was a fate worse than death. And Enzo? Lorenzo asked, his voice trembling with a father's burgeoning realization. My son. Sofia's expression darkened. The beggar? He's the loose thread, Lorenzo. The Gallis don't want a Costello heir walking around. They've decided that the debt needs to be settled in full. They're going to kill Enzo right in front of Luca. A final lesson for the prince. This is what happens to the Costello line. It ends in the dirt. Lorenzo let out a primal, guttural roar, straining against the chains until the iron bit deep into his skin, drawing fresh blood. The hopelessness of the situation settled over him like a lead shroud. He was chained, his allies were captured, his biological son was marked for execution, and the boy he loved as a son was being turned into a monster. For the first time in his life, The dawn of the most feared family in Sicily felt the cold, crushing weight of true despair. He had built an empire of shadows, and now the shadows were swallowing everything he loved. In a separate, smaller room nearby, Clara Ripley was strapped to a chair. Her face was bruised, her hair matted with sweat, but her eyes remained fierce. Across from her sat Arthur Sloane, who was casually cleaning a serrated blade. "You're a doctor," Sloane said, not looking up. "You understand the fragility of the human body. It's all just pulleys and levers, isn't it? If I snip this tendon, the hand stops working. If I pressure this nerve, the mind stops thinking." "You're a coward," Clara said, her voice steady despite the terror vibrating in her marrow. "You hide behind guns and children. You think you're powerful because you can cause pain? That's not power. That's a tantrum." Sloane smiled, a slow, terrifying spread of his scarred lips. "The Golly family wants the boy silent again. They liked it better when he was a mute heir. They think you hold the key to his voice. They want me to find the off switch in his head. And if I can't find it in his head, I'll find it in yours." Clara looked toward the corner of the room where a small, barred window allowed a sliver of moonlight to hit the floor. She thought of Lorenzo, the man she had seen glimpses of beneath the Mafia exterior. She thought of the way he held Luca. She realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that she had fallen for a man she was supposed to despise. And now that love was the very thing they were using to break her. "He won't stop," Clara whispered. "Lorenzo will come for us." "Lorenzo is a dead man walking," Sloane countered, standing up and walking toward her. "He has no men, no money, no influence left. He's just a father. And in this world, being a father is a terminal illness." Meanwhile, in the most desolate corner of the foundry, Luca Vallone and Enzo Mancini were locked in a steel cage. The irony was profound. The prince and the beggar now equal in their misery. Luca was huddled in the corner, his knees pressed to his chest. He was speaking now, but the words were a frantic, repetitive mumble. "Father is coming. Father is coming. He promised. He promised." Enzo sat opposite him, his back against the bars. He looked strangely calm, though his eyes were fixed on the door where the Golly guards stood. "He might not come, Luca," Enzo said softly. "The world doesn't always give back what it takes." "He's my father," Luca cried, his voice cracking. "He's my father," Enzo corrected, but there was no malice in his tone, only a deep, profound sadness. "But he chose you. He spent 10 years looking at a boy who wasn't his and gave him a palace. I spent 10 years looking at a man who was mine and saw a stranger. He won't come for me. He'll come for the boy he loves." Luca looked at Enzo, the realization of the swap finally sinking in. He saw the rags Enzo wore, the scars on the other boy's feet. He saw the cost of his own 10 years of luxury. "I'm sorry," Luca whispered. "Don't be sorry," Enzo said, standing up as the door groaned open. "Be loud. If they're going to kill the Costello line today, make sure they hear us screaming. Don't ever go back to the silence, Luca. That's how they win." Arthur Sloane entered the room, followed by 2 guards. He looked at Enzo and pointed the serrated blade. "The beggar first. The Gallas want the prince to watch." As the guards reached for Enzo, Luca did something he had never done in his life. He didn't hide. He didn't stay silent. He lunged forward, grabbing the bars of the cage, his voice rising into a defiant, ear-piercing shriek. "No. Take me. I am the Costello. Take me." It was a lie, a beautiful, sacrificial lie. Luca was willing to claim the cursed bloodline if it meant saving the boy who actually belonged to it. Sloane paused, looking at the small, trembling boy. "You want to be a Costello so badly, little prince? Fine. We'll start with you." Back in the main hall, Lorenzo heard the scream. It wasn't a cry of fear, it was a cry of war. It was Luca's voice ringing through the rusted iron of the foundry. The sound acted like a jolt of pure adrenaline. Lorenzo didn't just feel the pain, he fueled it. He remembered Vittorio's last words in that cellar. "Protect the light, Lorenzo. Even if you have to live in the dark." He had failed his friend. He had failed his biological son. But he would not fail the boy who called him father. "Sophia!" Lorenzo roared, his voice echoing like thunder. "Look at me." Sophia turned, startled by the sheer volume of his voice. "You think I'm broken?" Lorenzo laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance. "I am the man who survived the Red Moon. I am the man who built a kingdom on the bones of my enemies. You haven't taken my power, Sophia. You've just removed my restraints." With a roar of agony, Lorenzo threw his entire weight forward. The rusted bolts holding the chains to the ceiling groaned. He did it again, his shoulder dislocating with a sickening pop, but he didn't stop. He was a force of nature, a father fueled by the darkest hour of his soul. Is this the end of the Costello line, or can Lorenzo break his chains in time to save both sons and the woman he loves? The darkness is absolute, but the fire is just beginning to burn. This is the most intense part of the story so far. If your heart is pounding for Luca and Enzo, drop a "stay strong" in the comments. And don't you dare click away. The turning point is coming up next and you won't believe how the tide turns. Subscribe now. The ceiling creaked. Dust showered down. And then with a crash of rending metal, the bolts gave way. Lorenzo fell to the floor, the chains still clanking around his wrists, but he was free. He stood up, his dislocated arm hanging uselessly at his side, his eyes burning with a light that made Sophia Moretti take a step back in genuine terror. "Now," Lorenzo whispered, his voice a promise of death. "The debt is paid in blood." The darkness of the foundry was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary for a predator. Lorenzo Costello leaned his back against a massive rusted iron pillar, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. His left arm hung uselessly, the shoulder joint screaming in a white-hot agony that threatened to black out his vision. He looked at the chains still dangling from his right wrist, heavy, cold, and a perfect makeshift weapon. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have an army. But he had the singular, focused rage of a man who had lost his life only to find his soul. With a grunt that was more of a snarl, Lorenzo positioned his dislocated shoulder against the edge of the pillar. He thought of Luca's voice. He thought of Clara's defiant eyes. He thought of Enzo, the son he had abandoned to the streets while raising a ghost. Frick. The sound of the bones sliding back into the socket was sickening, echoing through the hollow hull. Lorenzo slumped for a moment, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of gray and red. He bit his tongue until he tasted copper to keep from screaming. When he opened his eyes, the agony had been replaced by a cold, vibrating clarity. He was whole enough to kill. "Sophia," he whispered into the dark, a promise rather than a call. A floor below, Arthur Sloane had Clara Ripley pinned against the chair, the serrated blade tracing a terrifyingly slow path along her jawline. "Where is the ledger, Doctor?" The map of shadows wasn't in the chest. Lorenzo wouldn't have left it there. "Did he give it to you?" Clara felt the cold steel against her skin, but her mind was racing. She wasn't just a doctor, she was a student of human behavior. She saw the way Sloane's eyes flickered toward the door every time a shadow moved. He was afraid. Not of her, but of what Lorenzo Costello became when he had nothing left to lose. "You're looking for paper," Clara said, her voice steady, even as a bead of blood bloomed where the knife pressed. "But the map isn't a document, Sloane. You've been looking at it all night." Sloane paused, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The Mancini inheritance," Clara continued, the realization hitting her even as she spoke it. She looked toward the cage where the boys were held. "The map of shadows is a tattoo. It was placed on the true heir when he was an infant. A map of the offshore accounts and the property deeds, hidden in plain sight." Sloane's eyes widened. He turned toward the cage, toward Enzo. "The beggar." "No," Enzo's voice rang out from the cage, sharp and authoritative. "She's lying to protect me. It's on the prince. It's on Luca." It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. Enzo was painting a target on Luca to buy Lorenzo time, and Clara was painting a target on Enzo to save them both. The confusion was the only weapon they had left. "Which one is it?" Sloane roared, losing his surgical calm. He grabbed Luca by the collar through the bars, shaking the boy. "Show me. Show me your skin." Luca didn't flinch. He looked Sloane in the eye. The boy who had been silent for 10 years was now the loudest person in the room. "The only thing you'll find on me is the name Costello," Luca hissed. "And my father is going to engrave it on your heart." Just then a heavy iron chain swung from the rafters above. It hit the first galley guard with the force of a wrecking ball, the heavy links wrapping around his neck before he could even raise his rifle. Lorenzo Costello dropped from the shadows like a vengeful ghost, landing on the second guard and driving him into the concrete floor. The turning point wasn't just the arrival of a savior. It was the union of the broken. Lorenzo! Clara shouted, her heart leaping with a hope so intense it felt like a physical weight. Sloane spun around, using Luca as a human shield, the knife held to the boy's throat. Stay back, Costello. One more step and the prince dies. Lorenzo stood up, his suit torn, his face a mask of blood and soot. He didn't look like a Don, he looked like a demon. He held the blood-stained chain in one hand, the links clinking rhythmically. Let the boy go, Arthur, Lorenzo said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. This is between us. The Galli family is already gone. My men, the ones who stayed loyal, have already retaken the North Gate. Sophia's coup is over. It was a lie, but it was a masterful one. Lorenzo's voice held such conviction that even Sloane wavered. In that split second of doubt, Enzo Mancini acted. He reached through the bars of the cage and grabbed Sloane's ankle, pulling with every ounce of strength a street-hardened child possessed. Sloane stumbled. Luca bit down on the man's hand with feral intensity. Lorenzo moved. The chain whistled through the air, catching Sloane across the wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. Lorenzo was on him in an instant, his fists delivering a decade's worth of suppressed guilt and rage. But he didn't kill him. Not yet. He threw Sloane aside and ripped the keys from the man's belt. In seconds the cage was open. Luca didn't run to the door. He ran to Lorenzo, throwing his arms around his father's waist. I knew you'd come. I knew you'd come. Lorenzo collapsed to his knees, embracing the boy who wasn't his blood but was entirely his heart. I'm sorry, Luca. I'm so sorry for the silence. Over the boy's shoulder, Lorenzo's eyes met Enzo's. The homeless boy stood at the edge of the cage, watching the reunion with a complex mix of envy and respect. Lorenzo reached out his other arm, the injured one, and beckoned. Enzo, Lorenzo said, his voice breaking. Come here. Both of you. My sons. The word sons changed the atmosphere of the room. The blood debt was being rewritten. The two boys, who should have been enemies by birth and by circumstance, knelt together in the arms of the man who had failed them both and was now their only hope. Clara, now free from her restraints, hurried over, her hands immediately checking their pulses, her touch a soothing balm. We have to go, she whispered, her eyes meeting Lorenzo's. Sophia is still out there and she won't stop until this place is a tomb. I know, Lorenzo said, standing up and pulling both boys to their feet. He looked at Clara, and in the middle of the carnage he saw a future. But we're not running anymore. We're ending this. Lorenzo turned to Enzo. The map? Is it really on you? Enzo shook his head, a small knowing smile on his face. No. There is no map on the skin. My father knew that if the Gallis thought it was a document, they'd keep looking. If they thought it was a person, they'd keep us alive. The map of shadows isn't a place, Lorenzo. It's a password. And only I have the half my father gave me. And only Luca has the half Sophia whispered to him in his sleep. The two boys looked at each other. The ultimate weapon wasn't a ledger or a tattoo. It was the bond between the two children the world had tried to break. Together, Luca whispered. Together, Enzo replied. Lorenzo looked at Claire, then at the boys. He felt a surge of courage he hadn't known since he was a child. They had the keys to the empire and they had each other. Let's go home, Lorenzo said. And this time we're going to speak the truth until the world trembles. The drive from the industrial graveyard of the foundry to the heart of the Costello estate was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and the heavy, electric silence of four souls bracing for a final collision. Lorenzo sat behind the wheel of a hijacked SUV, his dislocated shoulder screaming in protest with every turn, but his eyes were fixed on the road like a man chasing his own ghost. Beside him, Clara was reloading a handgun she'd scavenged from a fallen guard, her hands no longer trembling. In the back, Luca and Enzo sat shoulder to shoulder. One prince, one beggar, both now united by a secret that could topple a centuries-old hierarchy. The estate didn't look like a home anymore. It looked like a battlefield. The fire from the morning had been extinguished by a sudden vengeful Roman downpour, leaving the stone walls blackened and weeping soot. The Galli family's black sedans were parked in a predatory semicircle around the main entrance. They're waiting for us, Clara whispered, checking the magazine of her weapon. Lorenzo, this is a suicide mission. There are at least 20 men out there. They don't want me dead yet, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, tactical precision. They want the boys. They want the map of shadows. As long as they believe the secret is in this house, we have the leverage. But Clara, if things go wrong, you take the boys and run to the winery. Don't look back for me. Clara reached across the console, her fingers interlacing with his. For a second, the dawn was gone, replaced by a man who was terrified of losing the first real light he'd seen in years. I'm not leaving you behind, Lorenzo. We finish this together. They didn't sneak in. Lorenzo rammed the SUV through the front gates, the sound of rending metal acting as a herald. As they vaulted from the vehicle, gunfire erupted, chewing into the upholstery. Lorenzo moved with a ferocity that defied his injuries, suppressing the galley shooters with precise single-tap shots while Clara ushered the boys toward the grand library, the heart of the estate. They burst into the library, a room of towering oak shelves and ancient manuscripts. Standing at the far end, framed by the shattered floor-to-ceiling windows, was Sofia Moretti. Beside her stood the patriarch of the Galli family, Salvatore Galli, a man whose face was a map of ancient, cruel history. "Stop!" Salvatore roared, his voice like grinding stones. He held a detonator in his hand. One more step and the Costello history becomes dust. Lorenzo lowered his weapon, signaling Clara to do the same. The boys stood behind them, their faces pale but resolute. "You have the Galli heir, Salvatore," Lorenzo said, gesturing to Luca. "And you have the Costello heir. The blood is back where it belongs. Let the doctor go and we can settle this debt." "The debt isn't just blood, Costello," Salvatore spat. "It's the map. Sofia tells me the boys hold the key. Give me the access to the Vatican accounts, the Mancini treasury, and I might let you live to see the sunset." Sofia stepped forward, her eyes dancing with a manic light. "They won't give it to you, Salvatore. Not unless you break them. Lorenzo has spent 10 years teaching that boy silence. It's time we hear what they have to say." She lunged for Luca, but Enzo stepped in front of him. The two boys looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them that no adult could decipher. "You want the word?" Enzo asked, his voice steady. "The word isn't a password. It's a confession." "Speak," Salvatore commanded. Luca stepped forward, his voice clear and resonant, echoing through the library. "The first half is, in the shadow of the Father, the Son is a witness." Enzo followed immediately, his voice joining Luca's in a haunting harmony. "The second half is, in the blood of the brother, the truth is a crown." As the final syllable left their lips, a hidden mechanism behind the main fireplace groaned. But it wasn't a safe that opened. It was a digital screen embedded in the stone, flickering to life. It displayed a video file, a time-stamped recording from the night of the red moon, captured by a security system Sofia didn't know existed. The video showed the cellar. It showed Vittorio Mancini, but he wasn't being murdered. He was handing a ledger to a woman. The woman was Sofia. The video showed Sofia stabbing Vittorio herself, then calling the Galli family to report that Lorenzo had done it. It showed her swapping the babies in the nursery, laughing as she placed the Galli heir in the Costello cradle. The library went deathly silent. Salvatore Galli turned to Sofia, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. "You," Salvatore whispered. "You murdered the Mancini Don? You lied to the High Council for 10 years? You made us hunt a man who was innocent of the betrayal." "I did it for us," Sofia shrieked, her mask finally shattering. "I did it to bring the families together. Lorenzo was weak. He wouldn't fulfill the contract. You killed my blood for a seat at a table that wasn't yours," Salvatore said, his voice trembling with a different kind of rage, a Mafia patriarch's rage at being played. In the confusion, Sofia pulled a hidden derringer from her sleeve and aimed it directly at Luca, the child she had used as a pawn for a decade. "If I can't have the Empire, no one will." Bang. The shot didn't come from Sofia. It came from Clara. Clara had moved with a surgeon's precision, her bullet catching Sofia in the shoulder, spinning her around. Lorenzo was on her in a heartbeat, pinning her against the bookshelves as the derringer clattered to the floor. "It's over, Sofia," Lorenzo growled, his face inches from hers. "The silence is broken." Everyone heard. Salvatore Galli looked at Luca, his biological grandson, and then at Lorenzo. The old Don saw the way the boy clung to Lorenzo's hand. He saw the loyalty that transcended blood. In the Mafia world, blood was everything, But a debt of honor was the only thing that could stop a war. Lorenzo Costello, Salvatore said, pocketing the detonator. You raced a Galli with the heart of a lion. You protected my bloodline when you thought it was your own. The debt is settled. Sofia Moretti belongs to us now. Her fate will be decided by the High Council. The Galli soldiers moved in, but they weren't aiming at Lorenzo. They grabbed Sofia, who was screaming and struggling, dragged her out of the library and into the rain. Lorenzo slumped against a desk, the adrenaline finally leaving his system, leaving only a profound, hollow exhaustion. Clara was at his side instantly, her hands checking the wound on his shoulder. We did it, she whispered, her forehead resting against his. They're safe. Lorenzo looked at the two boys. Luca and Enzo were standing by the window watching the Galli convoy drive away. They looked like two sides of the same coin, the prince who had found his voice and the beggar who had found his home. But the final twist was yet to come. Enzo walked over to Lorenzo and handed him a small leather-bound notebook he'd pulled from the hidden compartment in the fireplace. The video was the distraction, father, Enzo said. This is the real map of shadows. My father didn't leave it for the galleys. He left it for you. It's the legal trail to legitimate every Costello asset. We don't have to be a crime family anymore. We can just be a family. Lorenzo took the book, his eyes filling with tears. Vittorio hadn't just protected his son. He had given Lorenzo a way out of the darkness. Is it true? Clara asked, looking from the book to Lorenzo. Can you really walk away? Lorenzo looked at the ruins of his empire, then at the doctor who had saved his soul and the boys who were his future. The Costello name died tonight, he said, his voice firm and full of peace. From now on we're just the Vallones. Lorenzo stood up, leaning on Clara for support. He looked at his two sons and smiled, a real genuine smile that reached his eyes. Let's leave this place. We have a lot of talking to do. 1 year later, the sun that rose over the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast felt different than the sun that had once scorched the stone of the Costello villa. It was a sun that didn't hide behind the smoke of burning history. It was a sun that illuminated the truth. The villa they lived in now was modest compared to the fortress of Lorenzo's past. There were no armed guards at the gate, no submachine guns hidden behind velvet curtains, and no heavy iron-scented secrets buried in the cellar. Instead there were the sounds of life, the distant hum of a boat motor, the rustle of lemon trees in the breeze, and most importantly the sound of laughter. Lorenzo Vallone sat on the terrace, a glass of fresh lemonade in his hand. His tailored suits had been replaced by linen shirts and a weathered pair of trousers. The obsidian signet ring, the symbol of his cold authority, was gone, buried in the depths of the Tyrrhenian Sea. In its place was a simple gold band. He looked at his hands. They were still scarred and his shoulder still twinged when the weather turned damp, but they were the hands of a man who built things now, not a man who tore them down. You're thinking again, a voice said, soft and full of warmth. Lorenzo turned to see Clara Ripley, now Clara Vallone, standing in the doorway. She wore a sundress that caught the light, and her eyes, once filled with the clinical detachment of a doctor, were now bright with a deep, settled peace. She had opened a small community clinic in the village, using her expertise to heal the people who had once lived in the shadow of the Mafia's neglect. I was thinking about the silence, Lorenzo admitted, pulling her close. And how loud our life is now. Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. It's a good kind of loud, Lorenzo. They looked out toward the garden where the two boys were playing. Luca and Enzo were no longer the prince and the beggar. They were simply brothers. They shared the Vallone name, and they shared a bond that had been forged in the darkest hour of their lives. Luca, his face full of color and his movements confident, was chasing Enzo through the rows of grapevines. He was a gifted student, his voice now a constant presence in the house, questioning, singing and telling stories. The trauma of the Red Moon had been processed, not through silence, but through the patient, unwavering love of the family they had built. Enzo had grown too. The sharp, guarded edges of the street child had softened, though he still possessed a wisdom far beyond his years. He was the one who had handled the transition of the map of shadows. Using the legal trail his father, Vittorio, had left behind, Lorenzo and Enzo had spent the last 12 months systematically dismantling the Costello criminal assets, turning them into legitimate charitable foundations and community investments. The Mafia didn't just lose a family, They lost an entire infrastructure. Enzo. You're cheating. Luca's voice rang out, clear and vibrant. It's not cheating, it's strategy. Enzo shouted back, his laughter echoing against the stone walls. Lorenzo watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He had spent his life worrying about his legacy, about the bloodline and the debt. He realized now that legacy wasn't about the blood in your veins. It was about the love you chose to fight for. Luca was a Galli by birth, but he was a Vallone by choice. Enzo was a Costello by birth, but he had chosen a life of peace over a throne of bones. They're going to be okay, Clara whispered as if reading his thoughts. They're going to be better than okay, Lorenzo replied. They're going to be free. The resolution of their journey had come with a finality that few in the underworld ever achieved. Sofia Moretti was gone, sentenced to a lifetime of isolation in a high-security facility, her name erased from the family records. The Galli family, satisfied with the return of their legitimacy and the settlement of the old debt, had moved their operations far from the coast, respecting the dead status of the Costello name. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the family gathered around the outdoor table for dinner. There was no mahogany, no silver platters, and no forced silence. There was only the clink of ceramic plates, the smell of fresh basil, and the continuous, beautiful stream of conversation. Luca stood up, holding his water glass. He looked at Lorenzo, then at Enzo, and finally at Clara. I want to say something, the boy said, his voice steady. The table went quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that waits for a gift. For a long time I thought words were dangerous, Luca began. I thought if I spoke I would hurt the people I loved. But I learned that silence is the only thing that actually grows the shadows. My father saved me by listening to my silence, and my brother saved me by teaching me how to break it. I'm glad we're here. I'm glad we're us. Enzo reached out and squeezed Luca's hand. Lorenzo felt a tear escape, tracking down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. It wasn't a tear of grief or shame. It was a tear of fulfillment. The mute heir had found his voice, and in doing so he had given a voice to a man who had been silent about his own heart for 40 years. As the stars began to peek through the twilight, Lorenzo looked around at his family. The empire was gone. The power was a memory. But as he reached out to take Clara's hand and watched his sons joke with one another, he knew he was finally the wealthiest man in Italy. The miracle hadn't been the voice. The miracle was the love that made the voice worth using.